I think virtually everyone in our audience, at least all of my friends who work in tech, are already familiar with Azeem and Azeem's background. So I will do my best to keep the intro short. But Azeem was kind of spent most of your career starting companies and as an investor, and obviously you're still investing. But recently, in the last few years, has really spent quite a bit of time thinking and writing about the future. Exponential View is probably the newsletter or the kind of media asset now that most people, I think, know you through. And that really is one of the best places to go to get a glimpse into, this strange and wonderful and exciting, exhilarating and terrifying future we're hurling into. So today I'm kind of hoping to talk to Azeem about a lot of the ideas that he's synthesized over the years into his latest book. We're going to talk about just broadly what's going on in technology and this kind of new age we're entering. And then we're going to hone in on what's actually relevant for creators and people who really want to make a living online, share their ideas, be a writer in this, new definition of what that means. So that'll be the gist. And Azeem, maybe I'm confident I haven't done you justice. When you kind of meet someone at a party and they ask you what you do, what is your answer now?
My kids ask me that question an awful lot because in the bit of London that I am in, there's not so many people who are working in tech, and there are not so many people who are familiar with what's going on in this self-sovereign creator economy. And so whereas people like me are 10 a penny in Dumbo and in bits of the Bay Area and in Austin and in Berlin, you'd step out of your street in any of those cities and run into three people who have a Substack and a SoundCloud and do a bit of angel investing on the side, and it's a pretty common batch. Over here it's quite and certainly given the fact that most of my peers in their late 40s, early 50s, it's quite uncommon territory. So writing a newsletter is uncommon. Having a podcast is uncommon. Being an angel investor in tech companies is uncommon. Working in tech is uncommon. I was one of a handful of people who worked in this field when I graduated compared to my peers who are going into banking and consulting. So it's a really hard question for me to answer to my peers. And then when I produced a book, it gets even more confusing as to what is this beast. You and many of your listeners will absolutely recognize it because you will all have done the same. So whatever word you use is the word I would like to use, but I would still need to spell it out here.
I love that description. It's funny. You called to mind Paul Graham, who I think is somewhere on the English countryside, who, is probably deeper in technology than anyone we know, and yet lives this kind of quiet life outside of Silicon Valley. And I guess I'm curious, I hadn't thought about this beforehand, but do you feel like that's helped give you kind of this, a bit of a different perspective on the future and what is unfolding? The fact that you're a bit maybe able to see the world as it's been for the last 100 years with a bit more clarity than someone who's maybe just deep into tech. I'm curious maybe how that's informed your view.
Well, I think it's an interesting one. I think you just get a different perspective. I'm not necessarily sure it's a better perspective per se, but it's a different perspective. So I am looking at the elephant from 100 feet away. And so I can see lots and lots of the shape and the detail, whereas in Silicon Valley, you're right up to the trunk and you can see the detail that says, hey, the trunk actually operates like a prehensile limb that you can do something with. Now, I can't see that from 100 feet, but you in Silicon Valley could see that because you're that close up. So I certainly have a different perspective and perhaps a different sensibility, and certainly the feedback that I get from Silicon Valley is often about that, both positive and negative. But I spent a lot of time going back and forth to the Valley, starting in 1996 and up until the election of Donald Trump. I probably made more than 70 trips to Silicon Valley, including 6 in the same month at one point from London, which is a lot. And that actually weirdly connects back to Paul Graham, because I was actually on the phone to Paul Graham in 1997 when he was running Via Stores or ViaWeb, which got acquired by Yahoo. Interviewing him, I was at The Economist, and I got a call that my dad was not well. And I literally just said to him, I'm sorry, I really have to go now. And I never finished that story. And I actually haven't spoken to him since then. But I think there is a distance, but I also have a familiarity in the sense that I've invested in a dozen companies out in the Bay Area, and I've been there 70 times. I've probably spent a year of my life there over the last 20 years.
That's a bit, yeah, but that's the OG Paul Graham story. Before he made it, it was Yahoo, right, that bought them, I think is, yeah, what you said. And Paul's always been really interesting because I feel like has always had this really broad view of technology, which I think you share. I think my experience working in tech has always been that the folks closest to it often can have the hardest time seeing its implications. And there's this great video that I'll one day dig up where someone asks a very young Mark Andreessen, what are the implications of this web browser thing? And it's kind of shocking how few things he can think of. Maybe you could shop on it. Maybe this would make it easier for you to send photos. And there's, I think, often this image of the hard charging technologists seeing the future, but it's actually sometimes folks who are maybe at that, 100 feet from the elephant who can see the beast. And this is kind of core to your book from my perspective. And we won't reiterate the entire book thesis, but I am curious to hear kind of, for folks who maybe haven't read the book yet, what are the big shifts and platforms that you're seeing being very important, over these next 20 years? And maybe, very lightly, what are the implications of each?
Well, I think before I jump into the platforms, there's one important element that exists in the book, which is this idea that we're really at a critical transition point, and it's about reading into the implications of things like software is eating the world, and that argument is really about general purpose technologies and how we think about general purpose technologies and the way in which they shape the structure of our economies and the way in which they create new potentials in ways that we perhaps can't see the second and third order effects. So, for example, the light bulb freeing us of the tyranny of day and night, and what impact that actually has, and where will that impact land after the ball has bounced 20 or 30 times. And I think that was important to make the point that today we have this transformation that is being driven by very, very critical technologies in key industry areas. And we should expect those general purpose technologies to make changes that are very, very deep-seated in our ways of life. The one that we're most familiar with is the silicon from which Silicon Valley is named. It's computing and the declining price of computing. Effectively, computing is now free. Maybe talk to your dad, mum, when they were younger, and they're probably, 60 years old or 70 years old, and you go back to when they were 10 and look at how much we paid for computer cycles, and you see how much we pay for it now. On any graph it looks free. And there are other technology platforms where that's happening. I identify what we can now do in biology, which is largely enabled in some sense by the computer realm, but there are some other techniques as well, which mean that there are not only things that were too expensive for us to do in the biological realm, but things that we simply couldn't do previously that we now can start to do in meaningful ways. For example, figure out how to get useful end products out of microorganisms or other organisms through various sort of synthetic biology approaches. The third area is what's happening in the field of new energies, and mostly thinking about renewables and storage, where these technologies are an incredible learning curve, where they are getting dramatically cheaper every year. And 4 or 5 years ago, I'd have arguments with people about solar power where they'd go, well, it's so expensive to generate electricity from solar power. And now it's the cheapest form of electricity anywhere in the world. And you kind of, it's not just my forecasting it, it's actually what happens out in the market. So that is a tremendous change. And then the fourth area of transformation is what is happening in the field of manufacturing. So in a sense, we haven't changed the way that we make things for thousands of years. We mold them, cast them, or we chisel away at them. And we have these new techniques which are more resource efficient, more precise, allow us to make things we've never been able to make before. And that's coming from 3D printing. And 3D printing right now is a little bit weird in terms of being very niche, but people are printing organs. I don't mean the musical ones. I mean organs for the body. They're printing houses. They're printing, this is more fun, right? They're printing with cannabis. And 3D printing itself is improving on a kind of 30% annualized rate, to the point at which companies like Desktop Metal, which is a publicly listed 3D printing platform, is already or very close to meeting price parity for producing unique 3D printing parts at the same sort of cost of just producing thousands of the same identical part. And that's kind of a remarkable shift. So the exponential age is really about these four platforms that between them will have these dynamic impacts on the way we organize our economies and therefore our societies, and how our politics will end up reflecting that and need to change to shape it.
Yeah, you mentioned something that with solar specifically that really stood out. I was talking with a friend who's been in tech for many, many years, and we were talking about how many ideas that are working today were research had started on in the 70s or in the 60s even, and that it took decades and decades before, say, like speech to text ended up, speech recognition ended up even being barely viable, much less commercially viable. And yet now it's rapidly accelerating and really working. But if you trace the history back, wow, it's kind of maybe sort of been a while. But at the same time, you have this idea in the book of combinatorial innovation that I think is maybe like easy to grasp intellectually, but maybe tough to grasp intuitively, tough to like feel and really understand. How do you think about how different maybe the rate of change is today, versus even maybe like 10, 20 years ago?
Well, when I started my my career, speech recognition systems were just being developed. Lanu and Husby and Drag and Dictate, and these systems were really remarkable in the sense that compared to the systems of the previous 10 or 15 years earlier, you had to have a dedicated processing box, you had to have a dedicated terminal in which you typed, and a special mic and a headset, and they were really low quality. By 1994, you just plugged them into your computer. I mean, they were still low quality, and they, were still, you had to speak at 4 words a minute. But that was an evidence of a kind of combinatorial innovation, because you could rely on the standard interface and processing power of the PC and plug in the specialist technology which was run in software. And I think we forget that the emergence of standardized components means that we can bolt things in from one field to another and create new innovations, which in turn grow the market. And this is just a case of incredible feedback loops. So one of my favorite examples is that you see in satellites, the average size of a satellite has dropped from like 3 tons. When you imagine those big satellites the space shuttle used to release with their gold foiled solar panels, to a bunch of like 20, 30, 40 pounds or kilograms in real weight measures. And the reason is that we've standardized on something called a CubeSat standard, which allows us to combine technologies from different industries without having to have bespoke satellite industry things from top to toe. So the processors and the machine learning algorithms and the sensors. And what that ends up doing, we've already we're living the smartphone dividend and the AI dividend to be able to produce these tiny, cheap satellites in combination. We now have many, many more of them around the Earth, and they're pointing back at us and they're giving us loads and loads of imagery of what's going on the planet. And now that imagery we need to do something with. And guess what? It's being processed by the same AI systems that actually had triggered off some of the innovations in processors and sensors and so on. So these things feed into each other. And the ability to support standardization and combination, the fact that anybody who builds any kind of application today thinks about its API, its application programming interface, which allows us to combine different technologies through the same kind of contractual mechanism, is a testament to people understanding the importance of standardization. Now, of course, what happens is that the moment people think they're establishing a choke point, they stop that standardization. And that's what's happened within Facebook, right? They figured out, well, we're now the place, so we don't need to allow people to remix Facebook in any other way. But of course, that clamps down on innovation. But where we are today is a deep, deep understanding of the importance of standardization.
Yeah, and this is there's a great question from Anna about blockchain that I'll bring up, because that actually does call to mind some of the blockchain philosophy that's currently in the zeitgeist. But Gian asked a question that might even be more pertinent, which is this balance between, you write about the kind of intersection of innovation and policy. And, from my perspective, there's that great meme of the guy tipping over a tiny domino that hits a larger one. And by the end, it's a massive domino. And, Facebook started as, let's find a way to share people, photos of cute people. And now it's disrupting democracy. And this thing is out of control. It's gone from a toy to this massively powerful platform that needs to be regulated. How do you think about balancing like free form innovation and giving people the tools to do new things with managing the kind of risks and maybe like negative impacts of these technologies? And yeah, how did you kind of even get into that niche and that intersection?
The framing of the framing of the issue has been, I think, really, really confused. There is somehow this idea that if you put some kind of regulatory behavioral framework around companies, suddenly they can't do good things. In reality, it's that they're prevented from doing anything at all. I mean, by which I mean there's some constraint, but it's not an all constraint. And I think that the debate has got really insalubrious around this area, because if we think about this idea of regulation, red traffic lights are regulation, speed limits are regulation, the way in which carried interest from venture capital funds is treated as a capital gain rather than income is regulation. And so there's normally, I think, a very, very unreflective discussion in this arena. And you can throw it back by saying, so would you like anyone to be able to make aircraft and anyone to certify their aircraft as safe, for anyone to claim that this pill cures cancer, for there to be no regulations about whether the claims in the financial product that I'm selling you are correct or not? And the special pleading that the technology industry makes, some parts of it, is really I can't put it down to anything other than we just don't want to have to think about this, because even as biological creatures, we live in a world that is regulated. Our bodies, the homeostasis within the biological systems that are us, is a pattern of upregulation and downregulation. That's what keeps us alive. And so I'm puzzled because what I often hear is people from the tech industry, and I'm from the tech industry as well, though, but people saying, well, it's not the DOJ settlement that did it. It's the fact that a new computing platform came along that hemmed Microsoft's power. And that might be true in that instance, but that is not an argument against having systems of good regulation that are suitable for a fast-changing world in which we live. And it's entirely possible to find those. Now, there are some people who are strict libertarians who think that everything should sit within the realm of the market. And those are people we need to be, it's hard to argue with them. But I think for most people, we live in a world which is actually vastly improved by having quality regulations. And we need to be critical about the nature of those regulations and make sure that they're not bad ones. And now we can argue about what makes good regulation and what makes bad regulation, which I think is a more healthy place to be.
Yeah, on that point, maybe just broadly, like what is your sense of what most people on maybe the regulation side don't understand about technology? If there's any valid concerns from technologists, what are they? Because I tend to agree with your perspective there.
I think that one of the things that people on the regulation side don't understand is that we don't know the answers, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be in many, many cases. That when we go out and build a new company or build a new product, the reality is that you never hit your plan. The reality is that you pivot. The reality is that you set 30, 60, 90-day goals with a bunch of OKRs, and you run week or 2 week sprints across all your teams to figure out what you should be doing and why. And so because of that, it's really difficult for us to say, well, this is where the risks are going to lie and this is what the problems are going to be, because we have to go and figure those out. And it's that action that is the process of discovery that allows us to bring out products and services that really tremendously change people's lives, whether it's eBay or Google or, whatever it happens to be. Google was making its money selling search appliances to people like IBM before they happened on the advertising business model. So we don't know, and no one knows. And we do, people do the best they can. And I think that sense of, well, how do we deal with incipient potential risks when no one knows what these companies will actually look like at the end is, I think, the thing that people really, really struggle with within the kind of institutional mindset.
Amazing answer. Yeah, totally. There's also this, to your point, this question of triviality. It's like sometimes the thing doesn't work for so long and then all of a sudden it does, and power can accrue very quickly. Whereas over optimizing for safety early is a trivial exercise because you'll never, your product doesn't mean much if it's got 1,000 users. So I'm going to kind of curious to start zooming in on maybe some of the areas of technology that are most exciting to you as kind of now an author and a writer and someone who really has leveraged the internet to like share your ideas more broadly. A lot of people in our audience are thinking through like, if 20 years ago, the dream was write a New York Times bestseller, if you wanted to make a career as a writer, go work at the Times or, whatever it might be. Now it's like, I want to have a big paid Substack. I want to maybe even launch an online course on the topic that I write about. And, a lot of this shift, this obvious shift that the internet has created is like a lot of institutions are now ceding some influence and power to individuals who are successful. So maybe just like broadly speaking, I'll maybe actually just start with what you've actually done, which is what got you interested in starting Exponential View, basically at all. And then why did you kind of go about choosing it to be a kind of like a newsletter and pick the format and approach that you did?
Well, you can have sorry about the banging. There's my gardener is doing something to
No, you're good.
Outside, and I'm right here. There's the origin story and there's the truth. So why don't we go to the truth? So I love the newsletter format. And in fact, I launched my first newsletters in 1996. And we used to send out about 500,000 mails within about 8 or 9 months. And it used to take 13 hours for the emails to go out. So they'd be sent from my computer under my desk over a 2 megabit internet line shared across an entire office, and the MX relay, the SMTP sort of host on the other side, essentially could only process around 30,000 an hour. So that's why it would take that long. And since that time, I have written newsletters on and off internally. When I was running strategy teams, I started my last startup called Peer Index. Actually started as a kind of a newsletter platform that was sort of algorithmically curated. So this was before things like Prismatic and Pulse and Flipboard, using a cross between human and algorithmic curation and social signals on things being shared on Twitter and Facebook. And that didn't grow fast enough. So the data science we were doing was really interesting. So we focused on that. So it's just a format that I like really, really a great deal. And then, and I think it's probably because I've never been good at bookmarks, and I've never been good at RSS readers. Even though I used like the first RSS readers, but way back when. And then the second thing was I had sold my company and I was a little bit bored, and I had been thinking about machine learning across social data for marketers for 7 years. I mean, it's long enough to make anyone weep blood. So I wanted to learn, and I figured the way to learn would be to write, because it would force me to think and it would force me to make the social commitment externally. And I would, what works for me on the newsletter versus the medium or blog platform or and so on, it are just all the constraints, and it's the regularity. And I just started sending it out to about 20 friends, and then it's picked up, and now it's about 150,000 people receive it through LinkedIn, and about 65,000 people receive it through Ghost, which is a platform I use for the direct email. And it's really, really grown organically from that time. But I have to say, I don't think there was that much design to it. It's just that I was looking for an identity, because I was no longer a startup founder, and I was no longer that thing. I was instead the VP of blah-de-blah, blue-de-blue, who the hell knows, in some company. And I think that was the way of going out there, and actually then also having some intellectual fun, which is what I got a lot of.
Yeah, I love that you brought up that transition of like identity almost, because that was one of the things I was curious to hear about. Being a founder of, we all kind of stick with our identities, but being a founder of a startup can be a very all-encompassing identity and experience, right? Running a company is like intense in a way that can be difficult to appreciate.
Yeah, I think unless you've done it, it's really hard to understand, and it's hard to understand how it envelops your purpose and your agency, and it's not clear what that company, and that's why a startup is so different to a traditional company, because a startup has nothing, yet it has so much. And these talented and committed people who get involved in building them are somehow become subsidiary to the startup. And which is why I think you see a lot of founder burnout, because we just think there is one more thing we can do. There is one more candidate we can look for on LinkedIn. I've spent hours on Saturday nights, late into the night, scrolling through thousands of pages of LinkedIn. Who is the right growth person for me? And messaging them all, hundreds of them. At the time, I've gone through and I've rewritten sales decks or added comments to the 30th document of the day for the 5th revision, because there's always one more thing you can do. What will be the thing that will push you over to the next stage of moving the thing forward? And it becomes all encompassing. It becomes your identity. And I'm not saying this is bad. I think this is what happens in high intensity, high performance situations. And I'm sure that if I was an ultra marathoner or a championship sailor, I would have the same view of my relationship to my training regime and to my competing, or a similar view that says you become a vessel for that activity, and it's hard to distinguish you from that activity.
I love that framing. And one thing I was curious to ask you is, how has that background in being a founder influenced your own writing and how you've gone about building Exponential View?
I have to, two slightly different things. On the writing, I'll have to rely on what other people tell me, because I'm the elephant can't look at itself. So other people tell me that I bring across the considerations of what it is to be a practitioner and what it is to be a builder in all of these areas, and that I speak in a different way to someone who might be an analyst, and the people I invest in also talk to that point as well, that there is a sort of an empathy and a recognition of what these things look like. But of course we all have our own biases and prejudices. I mean, I have very little to say about scaling sales teams because I never did it successfully. So as a founder, my knowledge is paper thin there. In terms of how we run Exponential View, I mean, it's been entirely bootstrapped. And even though there are now, that as of next week, there'll be three full-timers and 2 part-timers, apart from me. It's been entirely bootstrapped and driven by my desire for total control, and for better or for worse, even for the things that I haven't done, particularly well. Part of the reason for that as well is just that once you go down the route of bringing external capital, especially if it's venture capital, you have to start to adhere to certain benchmarks, and those benchmarks are also about the kind of returns profile that they are looking for in a business. And I'm not at that stage now where I'm going to take an 80% cut to my earnings potential for the promise of some never when a SPAC buys me out in 6 years' time. And so that, I think, is a really important consideration to have. Do you really think this business could grow and scale as far as it could? When I look at Exponential View, and we've had a lot of offers to invest, or even to buy it out, the problem is I'm not sure what I would be selling and what I'd be doing afterwards. I'm reflective of Paul Coelho's story of the Mexican fisherman, which I will spare you all. You can look it up. It's a lovely story. But essentially, what would I be doing it for that I can't see a path towards? So the point at which I actually start to say this looks like a startup and we're going to bring some additional capital, it'll be 100% on my terms. And it will be on a very frank discussion with the investors where I will say, this is a journey you will go on, and these are the things you can ask. There will be no privileges, there will be no vetoes, there will be no review of compensation. If you want to get on the bus, then you can get on the bus, and if you don't, I don't need you. And maybe it won't grow as fast as a consequence, but I think it works. I think for other people, it may that the calculus will be different. And in a way, with Exponential View, another reason I want to do that is because we want to have the flexibility and the agility to do what we are able to do. And so as we start to, I invest quite a lot in, because I can use the platform to see great founders and I can help them with the platform. And so that becomes also an important calculus when I think about how we grow the company, and how we think about whether external capital is something that we'd want to take on.
Yeah, that's such a great, I feel like the rise of, and I know this isn't maybe exactly how maybe you'd frame it, but I'd be curious, the rise of the kind of like solo capitalist empowered by their platform that they've built, is one of the most powerful and like overlook, like one of the biggest surprise careers almost that I feel like a lot of my favorite writers, usually in technology, have found themselves in. Like, it's very niche, but Packy McCormick at Not Boring writes this excellent newsletter, and within 8 months of growing that newsletter had, an $8 million fund or something. And that was like, and now is legitimately competing out traditional VC firms for deals because he can actually get them distribution and eyeballs that they can't.
I mean, the feedback that I get from the founders is that they really trust me, and they trust my analysis and framing of issues, and the distribution is less interesting than the conversation. Many of the founders I talk to are at such an early stage that their problem isn't distribution. Their problem is discovery. It is figuring out the true north of what they're trying to do. It is trying to work out where they sit in the landscape. And in reality, the best founders don't need help from their investors, and the best investors want to work with founders who don't need their help. So you have to, I think, have a bit of perspective on what value you will actually be adding in these conversations and discussions. But I mean, again, the feedback that I get is it's less about the distribution and more about the judgment. And maybe that comes from having being in this industry for 26 years and having built some things and failed a lot and so on.
Yeah. And maybe even having had your perspective shared broadly enough and serving almost as a lighthouse, filtering out who really resonates with how you think. And so Anna had this great question I think is going to foray into this next kind of few minutes of the conversation as we slowly get to a close here. There is this conversation going on broadly about like the creator economy and kind of how to actually make a living, largely just sharing interesting ideas on the internet. Crypto and blockchain is something I've heard you talk about a bit as again, one of these like interesting platforms that potentially might be quite impactful. I guess I'm broadly curious of where you see, if you have any kind of speculation on what the future of, say, being a Substack writer or trying to be a creator who's making their living full time on the internet. In your perspective, like what is that going to look like for most people over these next few years? We can start there and then I'll bring in crypto.
The thing to bear in mind is the power law. And the power law rules all in markets, and it's cruel in global markets because when we all live in little villages, the power law creates a rich chief, but the chief isn't really that rich. And when we live in a global village, there's a single chief, and that chief she's got all the wealth. And so what you see on Substack is the power law distribution. The top 20 writers net 20 million a year between them. The vast majority of Substack are not buying a single bag of freeze-dried ramen for their year, right? And so Kevin Kelly talks about the 1,000 true fans, right? Can you find 1,000 people to pay you $40 a year for the thing that you do? And that allows for, let's call a really modest lifestyle, 40,000 US a year before your Stripe fees. And what we've started to see in the early days is kind of this unsurprising power law where the vast majority of creators through their creator activities are not going to make enough to live a reasonable life for their level of education and where they currently live. But that said, there may be enough niches for enough people to do quite well out of it. But I think you have to think about this, right? So how many Substacks could there really be about Austin itself? So it's one of the biggest cities in the US. Could you imagine 10 different writers? I can't. I'd struggle at 10. I might imagine 4, right? Or 5. And those guys might only have 1,000 subscribers a piece who are willing to pay. So you then look at that and you say, well, that is the scope of that economy. And I don't think we figured out how to move the median up, where 50% of people using these platforms could say, I actually live a decent quality life based on the on platform earnings. I don't know where the Substack, how the distribution happens outside of that top 20. That they will know, but you can see from Twitch, for example, that the median person on Twitch, if you said you can only Twitch, would be starving. So, I mean, the median is probably close to 0, frankly, would be my view, right? And so I think that that's one of the things that you have to overcome with that sort of a role. Now, I think the thing that you can do, regardless, is that the art of, I can't speak to Twitch, but the art of writing improves you. It improves your thinking, it improves your network, it improves the people you can connect with. So you become a deeper, broader person in the field in which you're interested. But the really harsh reality about a lot of this is that it's Glengarry Glen Ross, only second prize isn't steak knives, right? It's second prize is maybe a spoon, and you see it play out in all of these areas, right? The discovery process is quite often what takes people to a creator, but it's not the thing that gives them the longevity, because we're all so fussy, and I'm sure it's true on Twitch, as it's true, or will be true on OnlyFans, as it will be true on, other places. It's like, well, why would you choose the second best if it's the same price as the best? And that is the kind of function that we have. So I think it creates an incredible opportunity without doubt. But there is this issue. I think it's Leanne Lee who wrote this. The creator economy needs a middle class. That how do you establish a middle class within a system skewed to power laws? And there might be things that you could do in terms of discovery, into how you create niches, and so on. But the problem is the whales will not say, hey, I voluntarily joined this platform and now I'm willing to redistribute some of my earnings back to people who are not as strong as me. I mean, they're not, some may do, right? I'm not going to say universally, but generally they won't do that. And then, of course, you're going to have the, let's call them off-chain, to use a blockchain term, actors like Spotify, who will come in and say, for 100 million, play there. So I think it's interesting. But as we get excited about it, let's also be clear about, the promise.
Yeah, and it seems like that cuts both ways. I love what you said about how writing can improve you as you're thinking, and there's all these maybe softer yet eventually tangible benefits. I'm curious, and something we talk a lot about at Foster is like getting folks to pay for writing can be very difficult, but maybe there's other ways to monetize down the road. We have lawyers in Foster who write about the cutting edge of their specific discipline within law. And obviously no one's paying for that writing, but you send it to a new client, they see your clarity of thought on something, and there's a new $15,000 a month retainer, and like you kind of monetize in that way. I'm curious if there's any kind of more creative or novel ways of monetizing that you see that may help folks who don't have that surplus of attention, ultimately kind of do well and provide for themselves.
I think niches can still work. And there's a guy called Dylan Patel who writes a Substack called Semi Engineering, which is absolutely fantastic on the semiconductor industry. There's probably room for 4 or 5 people like him in that industry, right? So if you can find a niche, you can find a niche. The other outside of the traditional model of, well, I use this to get some advisory work and I use this to get some, to strengthen my career professionally. I do think that there may be a model that connects to community rather than writing per se. And I think one of the strengths that we've established within Exponential View is that we have a kind of a proper full-on community that sits alongside the newsletter. And I think in terms of concentric circles, so there's a sort of 200,000, there's a 60,000 who are on the Ghost platform. Within the 60,000, there's a few thousand who are paying. Within the few thousand who are paying, there's hundreds who are active in the community, because we're onboarding people at a different pace, and that means that people's level of commitment and engagement gets higher as you go through that. And then, within the community, the hundreds who are active, there are some who are really, really active in the sense they're on my WhatsApp and we do things together and so on, and people find their partners that way in sort of business. So, and then the natural question is, is there some kind of token economics that can be applied to this sort of world, right? And that is a friends with benefits style. They're just for people. FWB is a community that uses a coin to get your membership, the FWB coin. So that's kind of an interesting model as well, where you construct something that is a little bit more sustainable and actually scales beyond the person individually. So the way that we've done this with an Exponential View is that in order to get into the community, which is called Exponential Do, you have to be a premium member, you have to be paying annually. We gate how quickly we bring people on board in order to keep the community healthy and respectful. But I have much less of a presence in the community than I do on the newsletter, because the community is meant to be a community. It's not meant to have someone who's distorting the market. And so that's much more run by Maria, who runs the whole of Exponential View anyway. And we do our best to kind of foster peer-to-peer interactions within that, so it has value in of itself, independent of Exponential View. But the access into that is now gated on, you're being an annual premium member, not a monthly member, right? You have to pay for the year. And then you could say, well, if you're doing that, can't you do something with a DAO or some other sort of token setup? And I think in theory, you can do something with that in the same way that in 1994, in theory, you could send a video file across the internet. It would just take you forever and it would be really hard to do. So there's also a question about technological maturity for technologies like that could be helpful.
That's excellent framing, and there's always this mismatch between narrative and reality, and excitement and technical feasibility and whatnot. And DAOs are a great edge area that are just, when you look under the hood, it still seems a bit early.
Yeah. I mean, it does, and it's early because if you understand your community a little bit and who they are, it would actually be an incredibly exclusionary tool, because you may have only 25% of people using crypto and only 1 in 5 of them ever experimented with a DAO, and then suddenly it's not what it set out to be.
Yeah, 100%. So I know we're coming right up on time, so I will wrap here. But I guess I'm curious if you were rewinding the clock, thinking about before you had to spend 12 hours waiting for the newsletters to sending out your kind of first few newsletters way back when, for folks who are just maybe starting to really harness the power of the internet and do have some aspirations to write more online and get a fraction of the distribution that you have. Going back in time, kind of what advice would you give, or what would you tell folks who are just getting started on their journey to really build their presence online with writing?
So I did a few things. I didn't realize I was doing them for a while, and then someone pointed them out to me. One thing was that I kept trying to meet new people. So I would, and then at some point when someone said, hey, you know how to meet people and you've got a really great network, I was probably in my mid-20s. I then for the next decade or so tried to meet 2 or 3 new people a week, just in my week, so that I could sort of do that and understand who they were and hear them and talk to them and so on. And that's really helpful because, when you know 5,000 people, or you've met 5,000 people and you have 5,000 business cards, as we did in the old days, that's the seed for your writing. But you also get a lot of new ideas from that. The second is that you just have to start writing and find your voice. And it takes time to find your voice, so you have to keep going. And you have to go through the shame of your first 50 efforts being crap, while you slowly get better and you identify what that voice is. And so that just is a case of sticking to it. And then I think the third thing that you need to do is make sure that you're not dependent on the success of that activity for feeding you. One of the, I've not taken anything out of, I make my money other ways, and it's tiring. You've done a full week's work, and I've had 4 flights and time zones and so on, and I'm sitting there on the plane writing the newsletter and then getting up at 4 in the next morning to finish it off. But it allowed me to do that work without feeling like I need this to make money, I need this to work in the next week or the next month. And so that's really a matter of how do you top up the tank and how do you minimize how much fuel you're burning. Yeah. So those are very basic ideas, but hopefully they're helpful.
That is incredible advice, and one I hope everyone heeds. I know we didn't talk about the book nearly enough, but where should folks follow you? Maybe it's obvious. Where should they get the book? Would love to wrap on where folks can follow you.
Yeah, the book is available at all the typical locations. It's called The Exponential Age if you're in the US and Canada, The Exponential Age. And if you're outside of those territories, it's called Exponential audiobook, Kindle, ebook, physical books as well. So that would, that's the best thing to do. I think people tell me the audiobook is quite nice. I read it out. So if you want to listen to me for 7.5 hours, you can do that. And then I live on the usual places. So on Twitter, you can find me at Azeem, Azeem. And of course, the newsletter is Exponential View.
Fabulous. Well, Azeem, thank you so much for making the time, and can't wait to follow along as we continue catapulting into the future together. So appreciate you making the time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for joining, everyone. Bye. See y'all.